2018 to join the LLS team and is passionate about bringing more industry development opportunities to the region. Tanisha is a keen horse rider and has recently been involved with the MLA Livestock Advisor Essential course, which is really opening her eyes to many new opportunities in the livestock industry. And it's also provided her with her first Uber ride experience this year in Melbourne. So I'd like to bring Tanisha Shields to the stage. She's going to be talking to us today about her new program that she's running, improving tactical grazing and tactical decision-making processes. Thanks, Tanisha.
Thank you, Caroline, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today. As Caroline mentioned, I'll be going through a program that we've developed at Western LLS to target a local need for improving tactical decision-making to manage rangeland pastures. Before I get into what the program is about, I thought I would just go through some background as to why we saw the need to develop the program. So what has already been spoken about this morning by a few presenters is that poor or declining pasture productivity is an ongoing challenge for all pastoral producers. This is largely determined by the seasonal distribution of rainfall, and we've already had presenters speak about how that is changing throughout time, and this really influences the growth and composition of our rangeland pastures. This has been recorded, particularly in the Western Riverina, but this is not just restricted to the Western Riverina rangelands. So there was a significant decline in vegetation cover and pasture yield recorded from 1994 to 2003. And we have observed that this has continued to occur. And as Andrew mentioned this morning, the proportion of key perennial species in the pasture mix across the rangelands has also been observed to have declined. So that's where we saw the need for monitoring and using the results of monitoring to guide the decision-making process. Here is an example of some of the changes that we are seeing. These photos are taken from the southern area of our region where the first group is working through this program. So we've got the image on your left, or my left, sorry, your right. So that is a healthy stand of bladder saltbush compared to the other image with the steel post in it where we've got a significant decline in the amount of bladder saltbush present in that pasture. This is on the same property, and this producer has identified that as a problem to their pasture productivity and an area in which they would like to improve. You might ask why do we need perennials in the pasture? Why is bladder saltbush or perennial grasses and things like that so important? Andrew already spoke about this morning about the importance of having perennials in your pasture base as they form the stability to the landscape, and this is becoming even more important, particularly in Western New South Wales. So you can see in the chart here on the screen, we've got the reliability of rainfall across our region. So the red, which is largely prominent on the screen, that indicates that it's very unreliable rainfall. And then as we get towards the blue end, that indicates very reliable rainfall. For the Broken Hill area, you can see that the rainfall in the region is largely unreliable all the time. So what that really means in this part of the world is that it can rain at any time of the year and any amount. So this is the sort of climatic systems that we're dealing with when we're trying to manage our livestock production businesses. The only time in the region where we start to see some reliability is in the south in winter. However, as you can see, that's still light blue, which is only sort of reliable. So it's still a pretty big challenge for pastoral producers. So the benefits of having our perennials in the pasture is that we need productive rangeland pastures to have a diverse mix of species, and this is largely due to that climatic influence of having unreliable rainfall. So our pastures need to be able to respond to rain at any time of the year to make the most of that rain, because it could fall in any season throughout the year. We need that diversity of species to allow that response to occur, which is a mix of perennials and annuals in the system. So in response to that observation of there being a decline in the perennial pasture base and the health of our general pastures, we developed a program called Improving Tactical Decision Making, which is developed and tailored specifically for the pastoral zone, and in particular Western New South Wales as the main first focus. So we're focusing on practices which improve whole property performance, which is underlined by your pasture performance. The program really focuses on building a powerful network with fellow producers so you can share experiences and ideas over time and that really allows you to build a bit of a network of what you're going to do. Throughout the program, we're running 5 sessions, which is conducted over a 12-month period, where producers are working through their ability to monitor, measure and record pasture, the resource condition, and of course, we're not forgetting about the livestock. We're also bringing in some livestock production metrics into the program. Activities that you are completing as part of this program are practical, and you take them home straight away and implement them on your property. As I mentioned, we have a pilot group which is currently in progress, so they've just completed their 3rd session of the program, and we are now taking EOIs to expand the program across the Western region. We have a group about to form in the Packsaddle area, so if anyone here is interested in joining that group or forming another group in your area, please feel free to come and contact us at the Western LLS desk. I will make the point that this program can be adapted to any landscape or pasture system in the rangelands environment. A lot of the examples I refer to today are relevant to that Oxley-Bulligal area, which is where the pilot group is, but they can be applied in all pasture systems. As I have mentioned, the aim of the program is to enhance how well your pastures are conditioned to respond to rainfall and also withstand a dry time. So we want to be able to make the most of the seasons where it does rain and also be able to get through those where it decides it just isn't going to rain. And we also want to be able to effectively manage our livestock to meet production targets. So we need to be making money along the way, as well as improving our pastoral productivity. The program follows a simple 5-step process, which was developed off the back of the Tactical Grazing Management workshop, which you can find out more about from New South Wales DPI and also in the glove box guide to Tactical Grazing Management. The first step of the process is to identify your target paddock. So this is the paddock that you'll be working on and focusing on throughout the 12 months of the program. So this is often somewhere on your property that you would like to improve or understand more about. The second step is setting your management objectives. So this is, where do you want the paddock to go into the future? Do you wish to maintain it in its current state or improve it in a specified way? Then we are identifying the strategies. So grazing strategies are how you're going to get to that objective. One of the most important parts of the program is the monitoring. So we are recording specific observations related to that grazing strategy, and then finally bringing it all together and making some form of decision, because there's no point collecting all of this information and then not using it to make a decision. So the first step is identifying the target paddock, as I mentioned earlier. We provide all participants with a very large A0 property map of their entire property, and that allows them to identify potential hotspot areas on their property that they would like to look into. Generally, people already have an idea of a particular landscape type or system that they'd like to see an improvement on or understand more about the response to rainfall. Once you have identified that target paddock, we select a place in the paddock that is reflective of the pasture, and we set up a monitoring site. So your monitoring site needs to be easy to find. Hopefully it will be somewhere that you normally drive past on a water run, because there's no point having it up the back of the property where you never go, because you'll never do the monitoring. You need to have it at least 100 metres from a fence line and 1 to 2 k's from a waterway, and that just gives you a good reflectance of the grazing pressure. It's quite easy and simple to set up a monitoring site. It's just 2 steel pegs, 10 metres apart. You stand at the first one and take a photo of the second one, as you can see on the screen here. This is an example of one of the monitoring sites that's been set up with the current group. The next step is to set the management objectives. So do you wish to maintain the pasture or improve it in a specified way? The main thing about the management objective, it's like a bit of a mother statement. It needs to be simple, realistic and achievable. So I've got some examples here on the screen of some of the management objectives we're seeing through the program so far. So some producers are looking to protect ground cover and encourage the perennial species in their pastures. So that is very simple, very broad and quite realistic and achievable. The second one is to maintain ground cover but increase the proportion of bladder saltbush in the paddock. So that is back to that example that I referred to earlier. It's a little bit more specific but still simple, realistic and achievable. And there's one person in the group that's quite new to the area, so they're looking at assessing the species composition of their pasture and trying to understand how that changes in response to season. The next step is to identify your grazing strategy. So what will you do to get to that management objective? So these are like the trigger points for when you're going to make the decision. So some people in the program have set a series of grazing strategies. We have something like maintain a minimum of 50% ground cover. So once your ground cover at that monitoring site gets to 50%, there is going to be a form of decision made. It doesn't necessarily have to be a removal of stock or anything specific, but there will be a bit of a conversation there around the decision to be made. Some people are looking for evidence of grazing on that perennial saltbush because it is the target species that they're looking to improve in their pastures and removing the grazing pressure when that occurs. There is a grazing strategy for not exceeding 30% utilisation of key perennial grasses. So this producer is looking to increase the amount of perennial grass in their pasture to improve pastoral productivity, so they're not allowing their grasses to get below that 30% utilisation threshold. And then also a key part of this is monitoring for saltbush recruitment events and judging the grazing risks. So that's not saying that they're going to remove the stock when there's a recruitment event occurring, but they're going to judge the risk of whether they need to remove the stock in the system. I can't speak that fast, almost quite. The next slide that will eventually come up on the screen is just about that recruitment event occurring. So we're focusing on, for this example, is bladder saltbush, and it's the same across many of the perennial species. So in bladder saltbush, for example, a recruitment event only occurs once every 5 years. So when that event does occur, an establishment event. So when that event does occur, it's really important to make the most of it. Whereas we've got recruitment, which is little baby saltbushes growing, that can occur up to twice a year. So there's a really big difference between that. As you can see on the screen here now, we've got tiny, tiny growing saltbush plants. And so you can imagine the risk that they're at of being eaten by livestock, and then all of a sudden that recruitment event has been completely removed from the system. So you may not even see evidence of grazing on the larger saltbushes in the pasture, but all of these smaller ones have been completely removed from the system. And the same can occur with the perennial grasses or blue bushes or whatever the key perennial is on your property. Once we've set the grazing strategy and the management objective, we need to then go into recording our observations, which is the monitoring. So each producer has been provided with a template monitoring sheet. This is the first half of the monitoring sheet, but we can tailor this to each specific situation. So depending on what your strategies and objectives are, we will update the monitoring sheet to reflect that. At the bare minimum, we're recording obviously site name, the location and the rainfall, and then we're also writing down that management objective and the strategies and making a comment about where you are in relation to that objective. So that sets the direction for future management about where you're going to take the paddock. Then we get into the more important parts of the monitoring. So here are some of the key parameters that we're looking for in the target group at the moment. So with the focus on the bladder saltbush, for example, people are recording shrub cover. So we're walking a 100-metre transect and identifying how many saltbushes are in that transect, and hopefully over time that's going to increase because that's their target, to increase the amount of saltbush in that pasture. So we're setting targets for each of these parameters. We're also recording ground cover, which is the key base management threshold for many of the people involved in the program. So we're doing that via step point, which is ground truthing in the paddock, actually physically stepping out what the ground cover is. And then we're also using satellite imagery to estimate ground cover as well, and then getting a bit of a correlation to see whether the two line up, because we can't always know whether what we're seeing from the sky is what we're seeing on the ground. There's also parameters like standing dry matter, and then the key one that people are focusing on is the main contributing species. So the main aim of the program is to improve your pasture diversity. So we're writing down what the key contributing species of the pasture are at this point in time and what the target would be for this point in time. So for example, at the moment the key contributing species might be poverty bush, copper burr and barley grass, and you may wish that to change to bladder saltbush, a key perennial grass such as windmill grass, and also keeping that annual such as barley grass in the system. And then we're also recording other data such as average pasture height and percentage green. For each of the key species, this is when we then start to bring in the livestock component. So we're recording the growth phase, which has a direct influence on the pasture quality, the utilisation, so the level at which it's being grazed, and then an estimated and actual digestibility. So the estimated digestibility is what you predict it to be, and then we're using feed testing to then identify what that actual is, so that over time, throughout the course of the program, you will get better at estimating the digestibility and understanding how that's going to influence your pastures. And some people are also using the unmanaged grazing pressure section to make a comment on what is also happening there with kangaroos and the likes. Here is an example of the data that we are collecting in relation to ground cover. So GeoGlam is a satellite-based website that's free for everybody to use, so anyone can access this. And you can get information from 2001 up until a month ago today about the ground cover on your property. So this is the ground cover for one of the monitoring sites that we're looking at in the pilot group. There is a little bit of a blip, as you can see on the black line for just about July 2008. It goes down to 0. That wasn't an actual measure, that was just a bit of a blip in the system. But you can see the ground cover trend through time. So that's the black line is total ground cover. We've set the target at 50%. And then the green line shows you the percent green, which is a very interesting line to see because that shows you the level of green response, and that often correlates with rainfall. So we've got years like 2016 where they had a very big response to winter rainfall in the annual flush, and then you can also see years like 17, 18 that we've all talked about where there was no green response. So that correlates to why the total cover was down. So this information can be used to show long-term trends and pick how you're trending over time, but then it can also be used to make more shorter-term decisions because it's available on a monthly basis. So you can have a look at the satellite today and see whether your pasture is, for example, on the screen here, it looks like we're trending up. So that's a positive. Whereas if we were sitting in April 2020, it started to look like it was trending down. So we might be starting to use that to form a bit of a decision that we need to make. The next part of the monitoring process is identifying pasture quality. So this is a key influence on livestock production from our pastures, and it's something that is largely not misunderstood, but there's not a lot known about some of the quality of our pastures out here in the rangelands. So we're taking pasture samples from 4 key species at each site at each monitoring time and sending them off to the feed test labs to get some results on what the pasture quality is. Here's an example of the feed test results that we're getting back from the lab. So we've got some samples here like fairy grass, swamp grass, cane grass, cotton bush and copperbur. The main parameters that we're focusing on here are dry matter digestibility because that is a key component that influences how much the livestock can eat. And of course, the more they can eat, the better they're going to perform. You'll most likely learn a little bit more about livestock production and nutrition in the next session. So this is just showing you how your livestock are potentially going to perform on the pasture. And we're also going to track this information throughout the season to see how that changes, especially for something like the cotton bush. We can see whether there's a particular time of year that it is of higher quality. So using that information, so a combination between feed quality and feed quantity, we're then looking to predict livestock performance. So focusing on digestibility, which is influencing potential intake, and then also the stage of production at which those livestock are at. So in relation to stage of production, obviously we know whether they're pregnant, lactating or dry, and then we're also doing a condition score measurement and then using the pasture information to predict whether they're likely to increase in condition or decrease in condition over time. And that can help us to decide what we need to do, whether we need to supplementary feed, remove the pressure from that paddock or move them to a fresh paddock. Once all of that information has been gathered, we then need to start thinking about making a decision. So it's okay for us to have done a wonderful monitoring observation sheet, but there's no point collecting the information unless we're going to use it to guide the decision-making process in some way. So we do highlight through the program, if I've got shrub cover written on the monitoring sheet and you're really not going to use that to make a decision, then don't record it. Record something that's important to you and your business for your decision-making process. So we're looking at things like ground cover targets. So are you approaching the 50% ground cover threshold that is set, or did you set a higher one? If you're approaching that, what decisions do you need to be thinking about making in regards to destocking or supplementary feeding? How is the key species utilisation going? Is the bladder saltbush under a high level of grazing pressure, or the perennial grasses, are they approaching that key 30% utilisation metric? And also, what's your predicted livestock performance? Because if we have heavily pregnant ewes that are about to go into lactation and we've just predicted that they're going to be declining in condition because of the pasture quality, then you may need to be making some decisions about supplementary feeding or, like I said, moving them onto a fresher paddock or the likes. So we're asking people to consider questions like, how are you progressing towards your objectives? Are you approaching any of your thresholds set in the grazing strategy? And is there a recruitment opportunity occurring in your pastures? Because that's what we're looking for, those recruitment events in perennials where they occur quite frequently, but remember they only establish every 5 years or so, so that does happen quite rarely. With the pilot group, we're receiving quite positive producer feedback at the moment, progressing through. Their main value from the program is coming from forming that small group. So they're really enjoying working with like-minded producers from similar enterprises and sharing knowledge and experience along the way. Most of the learning is done producer to producer with a little bit of guidance through the process that we've just gone through. People really love having the information given, and what's being spoken about is generally very relevant at the time because it's local producers, local knowledge and local conditions. So some next steps for you all sitting here today. If you're interested in knowing more about the program, come and have a chat to me. I'm around today, or my contact details are in the proceedings. If you're interested, submit an EOI. We will be taking EOIs from anyone, anywhere in the region. So if you're interested in forming a group in your area, definitely get on to doing that. If you want to go home and get started straight away, even though it's the after lunch shift and everyone's pretty tired out there, you can set up a monitoring site. It's just 2 steel pegs and you can start taking some photos, recording some observations and just seeing what the key species are in your pastures. Do you have a key perennial left in the system? Has it been removed? And when is your pasture more productive and less productive? And do you think it can respond to rainfall at all times of the year? So some key take-home messages from today. So the program is called the Improving Tactical Decision Making Program. It's not the greatest of names. I'm not known for creativity, but that is really what we're focusing on, is improving your ability to make tactical short-term decisions in the pastoral zone. And it's been tailored and developed specifically for the Western region in response to a local need. So it's not a program that's been developed in the higher rainfall zone and then adapted to out here. It has been developed specifically for you guys out here. The aim of the program is to increase your understanding of your key pasture species, and that will enhance your ability to make grazing management decisions and also improve the productivity of your livestock at the same time. And of course, the focus on monitoring, but then also using the results of those monitoring activities to guide the decision-making process is a key component to achieving your management objectives. I do notice we talk to producers, everyone is monitoring every day. You're all driving around the paddock, looking at the pastures, seeing what's going on, but actually recording that information over time or seeing something like the GeoGlam software where you can actually see it written down for 20 years worth of data is very powerful to show the story of where things are going and track some trends through time. And if you're interested in knowing more, there's a list of tools and resources. Thank you.
Does anyone use Poll Everywhere? Got one. So have any producers within your workshop, I guess, been able to increase their stocking rates? I guess similar to what Andrew was talking about. Have you seen any indication of that?
At this point in time, as we really are just in the pilot phase with the first group, it really is too soon to tell, and that will be largely influenced by the season and then the ability to make the most of it. But as Andrew mentioned this morning, by increasing the perennial base in your pastures, you have more ability to respond to rainfall at different times of year. So it would mean that when things get tight, they may be less tight.
Yep, we've just gone over here. I'll just come over so we can get the question on the video. Oh.
Have you been able to dig up much historical data and records for like the last sort of 50 or 70 years on any sort of photo points or anything like that to sort of show you how the cycles have been working?
I have some historical records for the Western Riverina. I have managed to obtain that information, and I've also just tracked down some more for the wider Western region, so I'm very excited to have a look at those and see how the trends have tracked over time.
Yeah, I've got someone home that's 70 years old, so I could probably show you.
Be very interested in seeing those. That would be good.
Are we on? Just wondering, how are you taking into account, say, some negative impacts of the decision making? Say, for instance, if people are focusing on one paddock, it could be to the detriment of other paddocks. So how are you helping them to take into account any negative impacts?
So the program, as we're focusing on that tactical decision making, it really is that short-term response. But as we develop into later sessions in the program, we do look at the whole property and identify areas that would be focusing on in the short term and then in the long term. So for example, you may have a pasture where you have the ability to have a very, very great impact in the short term compared to a paddock that would be more of a long-term project. And we're also looking at the trade-off. So for example, in seasons where you get a good amount of winter or autumn rain, you get that annual flush, so there is an option for natural rest in the perennial system. So in years like that, that is when we would be making a little bit more of those decisions, so there's less of the negative impacts. But we definitely are considering, Gus, that you may have to put more pressure on one paddock in order to optimise a recruitment event in another.
Great, thanks Tanisha. If there's no more questions, I will like to introduce Emma Shattuck to the stage. Emma is a livestock production advisor